So, Paul, start with the burning question, Ubi Caritas. How did that Royal Commission come your way, and what was it like knowing that that piece was being heard by 2.5 billion people?
Well, I tried not to think about that, actually. The piece that I wrote originally was called Now Sleeps the Crimson Petal, which is a cycle of 4 songs that look at the image of a rose, a sensual symbolism of the rose. And it was those pieces that were performed in St Andrew's University that the Duke and Duchess heard by some magical means, I don't quite know how, and they chose that, the first movement. There was then some debate about it, about the words. You know, Tennyson's setting of that, quite sensual. They tell the story of 2 lovers lying naked, entwined under the stars. I think that's rather nice, but the debate was that that wouldn't quite be fitting for a morning service in Westminster Abbey. So the suggestion was that we look at setting a sacred text, and Ubi Caritas, those words seemed quite appropriate. And then, with the magical help of James O'Donnell, I was able to finish it very quickly, record it, send it to them, and that was in.
So did James suggest you bring it up
He
into
did.
a different key?
The original key is quite low. It's in B major, and choir boys sing low, but they can't quite go that low. So he suggested knocking it up a tone, and it just suddenly brought a huge warmth to the piece, a different type of warmth that the original had. And of course it made it easier for them to sing.
Well, talking about small boys, I gather you came to music after having had an encounter with faith at the age of about 9.
Yeah, I every time I've mentioned this, some people find it quite surprising, but when I was round about 9, I had an experience. I'd almost drowned. I'm not a very good swimmer now, maybe I should learn, but I'd almost drowned in Dimlligwy, which is a small river in Anglesey. And as I came out of that, I began to realise that my life was not going to last forever. And it's like, if anyone's ever had a panic attack, it's like that sudden moment when you realise that you're not going to go on. And so you start asking questions, what else is there, if indeed there is anything? And I turned to Christianity, and I started singing in the church choir as a choir boy. I started finding those beautiful texts of Tallis and Gibbons and the Welsh composer Tomkins, and found in those words, those ancient words, something that I think brought me closer to God. I know it sounds slightly pretentious, but it's true.
And so how did the adults around you in those early years support you? Did you come from a musical background?
Yeah, my parents were amateur singers. They sang in, but nothing major. So it's really at school, and through the influence of one man as well. William Matthias was a great influence on me in my early... Not that my music sounds anything like William Matthias, as you'll hear, but he was the director of the North Wales Music Festival. And when I was a little kid growing up in North Wales, there really wasn't much music apart from that, and he brought the great stars to that festival. And I had the kind of the courage to pluck up the courage to go and speak to him at the age of 10. I said, "Excuse me, Professor Matthias, I'd like to be a composer, and I wonder if you could help me." So he said, "Yeah, okay." And so the next day I had harmony and counterpoint lessons in Menai Bridge.
Fantastic. And I gather you were also involved with brass bands and the sort of broader community of music making.
Yeah, I played in brass bands, wind bands. I played the euphonium and the trombone terribly badly.
And when your voice broke, was that a traumatic
Yes,
occasion?
it's funny because I've been talking to some people about this. Some people, it just happens naturally that they glide from treble into alto. That didn't happen with me. I had a terrible experience where I suddenly could sing one day, and the next day I sounded like Barry White. So it was quite traumatic for me, that.
And so clearly you developed as a choral composer, but alongside that, I gather you wrote a symphony quite early on.
Yes,
Tell us
right.
about that.
Yeah, well, I fell in love with Mahler. I was a hyperactive child, and the only way that my mum could get 5 minutes peace was by putting on Mahler, Symphony No. 2, because I thought that was the world. And I thought, I need to write a symphony, I can do that. And so with my Crayola crayons, I sat down and sketched the Crayola Symphony. And of course it's terrible.
Is it?
Yes, it should never see the light of day, ever.
You haven't decided to revive it? Or
No.
anything? No. And so then you went on to read music at York.
Yeah.
And what was happening around that time with your composing?
Well, York is a place where, I mean, anything goes, and all sorts of brilliant things were happening there. So I threw myself into it. You know, I performed in Stockhausen. I got into Brian Ferneyhough. I tried to have a go at some Boulez. All of these composers you may not know a huge amount about, but they certainly don't bear much resemblance to Tallis. But I found that wasn't for me.
And singing all the time, you were
yeah.
exploring choral repertoire.
Yep, always, all through my life, lots of composers say this, but I come back all the time to Gibbons. He's one of my favourite composers. I think CC, The Word is Incarnate, is one of the greatest pieces of English choral music. It's the New Testament in 7 minutes.
And then we were talking earlier, it's very interesting, you then went to Denmark
Yeah.
and did composition at the Royal Academy there. And you were exploring different styles. Were you a bit unsettled at that stage?
I think people who know me would say I'm always unsettled. But I heard, I fell in love with Sibelius. What I love about Sibelius' music, the great Finnish symphonist, is that every single note matters. And he uses that to create these beautiful structures in his music. And so the composer that had a relationship with him in a strange way was the Danish composer Per Nørgaard. And I wrote to Per asking him if he would take me on as a student, and he did. And throughout that year, I learnt probably more than I've ever learnt about music. He greeted me at the door in a pair of Y-fronts. So that was a very interesting start to that relationship, but a terribly fantastic teacher.
We were agreeing with vociferousness earlier that there is a sort of zeitgeist at the moment with respect to choral composition and composers. I'm very interested in your connection with other composers who work not in a dissimilar idiom, perhaps. James Macmillan, Lauridsen, these are people you know and are also quite driven by faith, I think, which is interesting. So how have those relationships shaped and driven your life as a composer? Yeah,
we were talking earlier, and I was delighted that we both came across the same conclusion. Now, you may disagree, but for me, there seems to be a zeitgeist, maybe is the wrong word, but there's a kind of movement now among composers that writing sacred choral music is okay. And there seems to be a style that is emerging. I'm talking about myself, Morten Lauridsen, of course, is the godfather of that, Eric Whittaker, Gabriel Jackson, Tarek O'Regan, Alexander Kampkin, these composers who are interested in harmony, rather in a sense than melody. And so this type of music, just like in the Tudor period with Tallis and Gibbons, composers like that, there seems to be a common trend binding us together, but with individual traits as well.
But they haven't all written operas like you have.
No.
So you've written one opera for Scottish Opera.
Yep.
Yes. Tell us a bit about that.
Yes, I wrote an opera for their 515 project, and it's called 74 Degrees North, and we'd hoped in that piece to blend operatic music, singers, orchestra, with electroacoustic music. So this is one of the first operas, apart from Birtwistle's Gawain, that builds those two different worlds together. Some of it was successful, some of it wasn't.
So do you think you'll go on to pursue that? Do you like the extended form, or do you feel more comfortable in smaller forms?
Well, I think what I hadn't realised in the opera is that you actually hand it over to people once you've finished it. And it's quite difficult, because most composers are self-obsessed, so it's quite difficult to hand over a whole work to the director, the dramaturge, the lighting guy, the costumes. So all of that thing was quite tricky for me. So that I'd found difficult, but yeah, I need to get over that.
So going back to the trajectory of your education, then you came back to York to do a PhD in composition.
Yeah.
Was that an important step?
Yes, it was, because I needed time to reflect on all of the things that I'd experienced as an undergraduate and in Denmark, and to try and then find where I was in this world that is music. And Jonathan Cross was talking the other week about, professor at Oxford, was talking that modern music now can mean anything. And if anything is available to you, where do you go? So for me, I went back to the beginning, where I started, and that's where I felt comfortable. It's important also that you don't feel too comfortable, otherwise you don't create anything new. So I think to blend the experimental times that I'd had in Denmark with more traditional tonal music that I was writing was quite important to try and get a meld of these two.
How do you respond to commissions? Because I was talking to Lauridsen, who said he just can't take them anymore because the pressure, it sort of is very inhibiting. So if he happens to write something and someone happens to call up and say, we would like something for this particular occasion, he'll make that dedication. But the pressure of having to write to a deadline actually creates a bit of a block.
That's right. I think John Rutter's the same. I don't think John does many commissions now. I haven't got to that, and I hope I don't. Peter Maxwell Davies said that there are two main types of composers. There are the Beethovens who struggle over every single note. It takes them so long to write it. And then there are the Mozarts who it pours out of them as easy as breathing. I'm kind of in the middle. I find composing, the ideas flow out of me all of the time, but I find that then structuring it and making sense of it quite difficult. So at the moment I've caught a blend of those two, which seems to mean that I can work to commission. But Hans Abrahamsen, my teacher in Denmark, also can't work to commission now because he finds that too demanding.
Yes. Going back to tonight's concert, we're going to hear a bit more about each piece, but obviously what binds a piece of choral music is its text. So, and I'm very interested in your selection of texts and how you relate to a text and what is the process as soon as you've chosen that text.
Sometimes the text is given to you in a commission. Loch Asiste, which we'll hear tonight, was commissioned by the University of Aberdeen for 500 years of its chapel consecration. And so, of course, the text, this place is Blessed Sacrament, is given to you. And that's quite a beautiful sense when you've got that, because you then have a structure to work around. When you're choosing text, for me, it's important that it means something very much to me. And in the final movement of my Now Sleeps the Crimson Petal, A Spotless Rose text, I knew from when I sang the Howls. But that text is so important because it's about love, it's about motherly love, it's about everything that I find great at Christmas time. And it shows the rose as this beautiful, beautiful gift from God. And so for me, I just found that text and it spoke to me in many different levels. But when I find a text, I try to find if there's some musical structure in it. So at the beginning of my piece, A Spotless Rose, the music starts in the middle of the choir and opens out in all directions as the choir moves so that you get a visual and oral representation of the rose itself. So sometimes the title suggests the music.
I'm very pleased that you're going to be published by Novello, which was the company I used to work for. And being published, are you aware then of the need to be adaptable to various choirs, different choirs, or will you write regardless of levels of complexity?
Well, again, that's a difficult question, and I think that because I write a lot of music in all types of styles, I think it's important. I think this is one of the things that composers like John Rutter do brilliantly, is that they can write a tune. I mean, look at What Sweeter Music. I mean, is there a greater piece than that? And he's able to write music that choirs can sing. And so it's important to have that craft that a basic choir can sing music, even though you want to try and put something of yourself, something complex in it as well. You want to try and say something about the world yourself. So I shall do both.
Yes, good. I commission quite a lot of works for various choirs, and I'm very aware that the composer has in his mind, or her mind, the ability of the choir in mind. And do you prefer to have some structure, some sort of prescription, or do you like completely free rein?
Hans Abrahamsen said you find freedom in form.
Yes.
And I think that for me, knowing the choir, for example, you've got Westminster Abbey Choir, you can do anything. You've got Tenebrae, you can do anything. But if you've got the little church choir down the road, I don't mean down this road, that's a good church choir, but I mean if you've got a little choir that's got a bass, a tenor or something, and they are asking you to write a piece, then you have to fulfill that and write them a good piece that they can sing.
Well, you've achieved what many would regard as sort of being in its own right, the sort of apex of a career. How do you see the future? I mean, do you just hope that opportunities will come your way, or do you have an end in sight, a sort of end goal?
I never had a beginning in sight, so having an end in sight is quite tricky. It's when you're a young composer, some of the greatest things that you can imagine is getting your music performed. That's the most important thing. And the great thing that the Duke and Duchess did for me was gave me that platform. So I was able to have that piece sang at one of the biggest platforms. From that, this wonderful evening, a celebration of this CD that Decca has put out, be published now by Novello. I mean, all of my dreams have kind of been ticked in 3 boxes. I don't think I can ask for anything else. I think that's it.
Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you.